You've shared your life with someone for 7 years. You know how they take their coffee. You know which side of the bed they sleep on. You know the sound they make when something is wrong before they've said a single word. Now, imagine finding out that person, the one you built everything with, was never entirely real. Not a fraud, not a con artist after your money. Something far more disorienting than that. A person who genuinely existed, who genuinely lived beside you, who may have genuinely loved you, but who was also, at every moment, someone else entirely. Someone trained to be there, placed there, by people you will never meet for reasons that had nothing to do with you. Daniel didn't find this out in a dramatic way. There was no confrontation in an airport, no men in black cars. He found a phone. It looked exactly like her phone. Same model, same case, same small scratch on the corner. But when the screen lit up, it wasn't her screen. And in the 3 seconds before he put it back down and walked to the kitchen and stood very still, he understood, not the details, not the full truth, but the shape of the thing. The shape that had been there all along. What he didn't know yet was that the discovery was the least complicated part of the story. Her name, for the purposes of this account, is Miriam. That is not her name. She was recruited by Israeli intelligence in her late 20s. The handlers who first met her noted the same things in their initial assessment: 3 languages without accent, a natural capacity for social mirroring, and the rarest quality in this line of work, patience. Not the patience of someone who waits, the patience of someone who understands that a thing built slowly is a thing that holds. She was not sent somewhere dangerous immediately. That would have been an amateur use of someone like her. For the first 2 years after recruitment, Miriam was deployed to do something that sounds almost mundane. She lived. She moved to a European city, took a position at an international trade consultancy, made friends, joined a book group, argued with her landlord about the heating. Her handlers watched this period not to direct her but to assess her. Could she inhabit a life without daily instruction? Could she become, in the truest and most functional sense, a person who simply existed there? By the end of year 2, the answer was yes, which is when the operation actually began. The target was not a person. Not initially, it was a network. A loose architecture of financial intermediaries operating across 3 countries. The kind of people who move money and documents and occasionally other things for whoever is paying. Within that network, Israeli intelligence had identified a pattern. Communication that suggested a former asset had turned. Someone who had once worked with them was now feeding information to a hostile service. To find that person, they needed access to the network from inside it. And the way into that network, the natural, unsuspicious way, was through a relationship with someone already trusted inside it, which meant Miriam needed a life that made her presence in the city permanent, unquestionable, and above all, domestic. A lease could be checked. A job could be verified. But a marriage, a real marriage, to a real civilian, with a shared apartment and a shared dinner table and the entirely ordinary weight of a shared life, that was the kind of cover that doesn't get questioned, because it can't be faked at that level of detail. Or, so the assumption goes. Daniel was not selected as a target. This distinction, if you understand anything about how these operations work, is significant. He was not being cultivated for information. He was not connected to the network. He was, in the cold vocabulary of the operation, what handlers sometimes call ambient cover. A real relationship with a real person, used not as a source but as a frame. Something to make the picture look right. Before Miriam allowed the relationship to develop, her handlers ran a quiet assessment of Daniel. His professional background, his family, his political views, his travel history, the general shape of how he moved through the world. He was an architectural consultant, methodical, loyal, the kind of person who believes what he is told because he has not yet been given a reason not to. He was assessed as low risk, which in this context means unlikely to stumble onto anything, unlikely to ask the wrong question in the wrong moment, unlikely to become a complication. That assessment was not entirely wrong. Daniel was not the type to demand explanations. He was the type to notice things quietly and file them away and wait. What the handlers had failed to model was what happens when a patient, careful person accumulates enough small inconsistencies and finally opens the file they've been keeping without knowing they were keeping it. Miriam and Daniel married in the 3rd year of her cover. The wedding was small and real. His family attended. Her family was a constructed narrative, parents who had died young, a childhood in a city she knew only from photographs and research. She had memorized it well enough that it didn't feel like memorization anymore. It felt like memory. That is the point at which a legend becomes genuinely dangerous, not to the operation, but to the person running it. There were, at that wedding, people who knew who she actually was. None of them were on the guest list. By year 4, Miriam had done something her handlers considered a significant operational achievement. She had built a genuine relationship with a man named Raza. Raza was not the target either, but Raza had access to the target without knowing it. He was connected to the financial network through 2 intermediaries, close enough to be useful, far enough removed to feel safe. He had come to regard Miriam as something close to a confidant. They had the kind of friendship that forms between 2 people living abroad, in a city that isn't quite theirs, who find in each other a version of home. Miriam's handlers were pleased with this. Raza talked. Not about anything operational, not in ways he would have recognized as sensitive, but he mentioned things, names, cities, timings. The way someone complains about a colleague without realizing the complaint is also a map. What Miriam reported back about Raza, consistently, was that he trusted her completely, that he had no suspicions, that the relationship was solid. She believed that. She had no reason not to. Here is where the first real problem begins. Not with Raza, not with Daniel, with Miriam herself. The cognitive architecture of deep cover, the thing no training fully prepares an operative for, is not the fear of exposure. Fear can be managed. Fear is a known variable. What is harder to manage is the continuous, low-level labor of maintaining 2 complete emotional lives simultaneously. When Daniel asked her something about her past, she answered from the legend. When her handler asked her about her marriage, she answered carefully, selectively. When she was with Raza, she was the expatriate friend. When she was at home, she was the wife. At no point could she simply be whoever she actually was, because by year 4, she was no longer entirely sure who that was. She slept less. Not dramatically, not in ways that would have been obvious, but Daniel noticed. He noticed because he was, beneath the ordinary surface of his life, the kind of person who notices. He asked her once if something was wrong. She said it was work. He said he trusted her. She said she knew. She could not tell him that his trust was the most complicated thing in the room. And somewhere, in a city Miriam couldn't account for, through a channel she didn't know existed, a man who was supposed to be her most valuable asset was having a very different kind of conversation about her. What that conversation contained, who initiated it, and what it would eventually cost, that is what Miriam did not know yet. The trade consultancy where Miriam worked was not a cover in the traditional sense. She actually worked there. She attended meetings, filed reports, managed client relationships across 4 time zones. Her colleagues respected her. Her supervisor had twice recommended her for a senior position. This is a detail that matters. The best legends are not hollow. They have weight. They have the kind of professional credibility that makes casual investigation pointless because there is nothing casual to find. Miriam had not been installed into a fake job at a fake company. She had been placed into a real one, where she performed well enough that her presence there required no maintenance, no monitoring, no ongoing justification. The job was the legend. The legend was the job. What existed alongside it, the operational layer, the actual work, moved in a completely different register. Slower, more oblique. Built not on deliverables and quarterly reviews, but on the accumulation of proximity, on being, over months and then years, the kind of person that certain other people eventually stopped being careful around. By the beginning of year 5, Miriam had access she had not had before. Not access in the sense of files or documents, access in the sense of atmosphere. She had become part of a social ecosystem that included, at its edges, people connected to the financial network her handlers needed her inside. She knew them the way you know people you see regularly at the same restaurants, the same private dinners, the same informal gatherings that European professional life produces in abundance. She was not pushing. She was simply there. Reliably, warmly, usefully there. Her handler, a man she met every 3 weeks in a different location, always briefly, always in the open, always in a context that looked like nothing, told her during one of these meetings that the operation was progressing well, that the intelligence she was producing was being taken seriously at a level above his, that the patience she was exercising was exactly the right instrument. He was not a man who gave compliments carelessly. She understood the meeting to mean keep going. Everything is working. She kept going. What she produced over the following 6 months was not spectacular intelligence. It was not the kind of material that ends up footnoted in histories. It was granular, specific, the kind of detailed, low-level operational texture that analysts need to build a picture that other methods can't produce. She reported on communication patterns, on which names came up in conversation and in what context, on which of the intermediaries appeared to be operating under new constraints, more careful, more guarded, in ways that suggested they had been told to be. She reported on Raza specifically, who he called, who he met, the subtle shift she had noticed in how he spoke about certain business relationships. Her handlers processed this, assessed it, integrated it with material from other sources she was not aware of. The picture they were building pointed with increasing resolution toward a specific individual. Not yet confirmed, but close. Miriam knew none of this in full. She was given only what she needed to continue her work. This is standard. An operative who knows the complete picture of their own operation is an operative who can, under pressure, compromise it. The information is rationed not because of distrust, but because of operational architecture. She understood this. She had been trained to understand it. What she had not been trained for, what the architecture had not accounted for, was what it costs a person to work in deliberate partial blindness for 5 years, to act on instructions whose full logic you are not permitted to see, to trust that what you are being told is sufficient when every instinct you have developed over years of careful observation is telling you that something is not complete. She trusted her handler. She also, by year 5, trusted him the way you trust a person you have no alternative but to trust, which is a different thing. The Raza problem did not announce itself clearly. That is the nature of the Raza problem. It arrived as a feeling first. Operatives are trained to distrust feelings. They are trained to demand evidence, to test intuition against observable behavior, to not act on instinct until instinct has been verified by something external and specific. But feelings exist for a reason. They are pattern recognition that hasn't yet found its language. What Miriam began to feel, somewhere in the second half of year 5, was that Raza's openness had a quality she couldn't name. Not dishonesty. She had spent enough time studying dishonesty to recognize it in its major forms. Something different. Something that felt, increasingly, like permission. Like he was telling her exactly as much as he had decided she should know. Like the conversation she believed she was steering was in fact steered. She mentioned this once, obliquely, to her handler. She said she was not certain Raza's trust was as complete as she had previously assessed. Her handler asked her what had changed. She said nothing specific, a feeling. He told her that feelings were not intelligence. He told her to continue with Raza. He told her that the relationship was productive, and that the current phase of the operation required stability, not recalibration. She accepted this. She went back to work. The feeling did not go away. Then Raza was arrested. not for anything connected to the network. A European financial crimes unit had been building a separate case for over a year: tax structures, beneficial ownership concealment. The kind of white-collar investigation that moves slowly and announces itself only at the end. Raza was one of 6 individuals named. He was released on bail within 48 hours. His lawyers indicated the charges were manageable. But the arrest did what arrests do inside closed networks. It sent a signal, and signals in networks built on operational security and mutual discretion produce reactions that are faster and less rational than the people inside them would prefer. Contacts went quiet. Meetings were canceled. The easy social atmosphere that Miriam had spent years cultivating contracted, almost overnight, into something guarded and careful. And Miriam's name, which appeared in Raza's communication logs with a frequency that, in a normal friendship, would be unremarkable, was now on a list somewhere that it had not been on before. Her handler made a decision. They met not in their usual rotation but on 3 days' notice, in a city she had to travel to on a reason she had to construct. She told Daniel it was a client meeting. He accepted this. She was aware on the train that she was now lying to her husband about a meeting with the people she had been lying to her husband for. The layering had become recursive. She noticed this. She set it aside. Her handler told her the situation clearly. The network had tightened. Her exposure risk had increased. The timeline on the operation needed to accelerate. And there was a decision to be made about whether to push forward or extract. He told her the push-forward option required her to move closer to 2 specific individuals, faster than the operation's original pace had intended, faster than was comfortable. Fast enough that the naturalness of it, which had always been her primary protection, would have to be partially simulated. She told him that partially simulated was not the same as real, that the network would feel the difference. He told her that the intelligence community was very close to a confirmation they had been working toward for 3 years. That extraction now would cost that confirmation. That the cost of staying was elevated but not unacceptable. She asked him to define unacceptable. He said, "You'll know it if it happens." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "That is not a definition. That is a reassignment of the risk." He did not disagree with her. He told her the decision was hers. He told her this in the tone of a person who knows the decision is not, in any meaningful operational sense, hers. She said she would stay. She said it because it was expected. She also said it because she was genuinely not ready to leave. Because the life she had been living for 5 years had accumulated a weight she couldn't simply walk away from. Because Daniel was at home, and the idea of what the next phase looked like, the extraction, the debrief, the return to something that had preceded all of this, did not yet have a shape she could hold. She returned on the evening train. She cooked dinner. She listened to Daniel talk about a project he was working on, a renovation, a difficult client, something about load-bearing walls. She asked questions. She was present. She was, by every visible measure, a wife having dinner with her husband. She was also, at the same moment, sitting with the fact that her handler had not told her everything, that the phrase elevated but not unacceptable had been used to describe a risk he had not quantified, that the feeling about Raza, the feeling she had reported, which had been dismissed as unverified instinct, was still there, unchanged, waiting. And that somewhere in the architecture of the operation she was inside, something had already shifted in a way that had not yet reached her. She just didn't know what it was yet, or whether, by the time she found out, there would be anything left to do about it. The 2 individuals her handler had identified were named in her operational notes only by numbers. In her own mind, she had given them names, which is something operatives are trained not to do. Names create familiarity. Familiarity creates hesitation. She knew this. She did it anyway, which should have told her something about where she was in year 5 of a life she had not originally planned to still be living. She called them the accountant and the architect, not because of their professions. The accountant was a logistics coordinator, and the architect had something to do with shipping insurance. but because of how they moved through a room. One calculated everything before acting. One built the structure and let others fill it. Her handler wanted her closer to both of them. Closer, faster than anything she had built before. She started with the accountant because he was easier. He had attended 2 of the same informal gatherings she had been part of over the previous year. He had spoken to her briefly at both. He was the kind of man who tracked who had spoken to him and felt, subtly and continuously, that people hadn't spoken to him enough. This is a usable vulnerability, not a dramatic one, not the kind that produces sudden access or immediate revelation, but the kind that, worked carefully over several weeks, produces a person who begins to look forward to your presence without being able to say exactly why. She arranged to be at a dinner where she knew he would be present. She sat 2 seats away, not adjacent. She spoke to him twice, once briefly at the table, once for slightly longer near the end of the evening when the gathering had loosened and people were moving between conversations. She did not push. She expressed a professional interest in a subject he had mentioned, asked one specific question, and then redirected the conversation toward him before he had finished answering. He called her the following week. He had a reason. Ready, a professional reason, a question about something she had mentioned, but the professional reason was thin and they both understood it was thin. She treated it as entirely sufficient. They had coffee. The accountant talked for most of it. She reported this to her handler as a productive first contact. Her handler said, "Move faster." She moved faster with the architect because the handler had indicated he was the more time-sensitive of the 2. She arranged a reason to contact him directly, a referral from a mutual acquaintance, a professional introduction that was real enough to survive any scrutiny he might apply to it. He agreed to meet. She went to the meeting with a clear objective, establish enough mutual interest for a second meeting without appearing to want a second meeting. The meeting went wrong almost immediately, not catastrophically, not in a way that closed anything down. But she arrived and found that the architect had brought someone she hadn't expected. A colleague, apparently, introduced casually, who sat through the entire meeting without contributing much and whose presence she couldn't account for. A person who watched more than he spoke, who looked at her twice, at moments when she wasn't looking at him, in a way she caught in her peripheral vision. She adjusted. She let the meeting run shallow, professional, cordial, useful enough on its surface to justify a follow-up, but without anything in it that she couldn't afford to have witnessed. She kept it clean. On the street afterward, walking toward the metro, she ran through the meeting detail by detail and reached a conclusion. The colleague was probably nothing. Probably a standard precaution from a man who had recently watched a network associate get arrested. Probably caution rather than investigation. She believed this conclusion because it was the more manageable of the 2 options. She did not report the unexpected presence to her handler that evening. She told herself she would include it in the regular report in 2 days. She did include it, eventually, framed as a minor variable, assessed as low significance. Her handler did not flag it, which confirmed in her mind that she had assessed it correctly. She had not assessed it correctly, but the confirmation felt real, because confirming silences feel identical to meaningful ones. 6 weeks into the accelerated phase, something happened that she had not experienced before in the operation, and that she did not know how to categorize. It worked, not partially, not in a guarded, preliminary way that required further development. The accountant, in a conversation that had started as a professional discussion about a specific cross-border transaction, said something that mapped precisely onto an intelligence gap her handlers had been trying to fill for 7 months. He said it without apparent awareness of its significance. He said it the way people say important things, casually, as elaboration, as context for something else. She kept her face exactly right. She moved the conversation forward. She gave him nothing to read in her response that would suggest the information had weight. That evening, she filed a report that she knew, the moment she sent it, was the most operationally significant thing she had produced in 18 months. Her handler confirmed this within hours. He used, for the first time in 5 years, the word exceptional. She sat in the kitchen after Daniel had gone to sleep and she held that word for a while. Exceptional. She understood it operationally. She also understood, in a different and quieter register, that it had cost her something to produce it, that the accountant had told her something true because he trusted her, and that his trust was the direct result of 6 weeks of careful, deliberate construction, not friendship, the architecture of friendship. She drank her tea, she went to bed. She slept less than 3 hours. The near abort happened 10 days later. Daniel found a number in her call log that he didn't recognize. Not the second phone. He hadn't found that yet. Her regular phone, the one he knew, which she had always managed carefully, except for one call she had taken in the car while he was in a shop, a call that had lasted 4 minutes, a call she had not deleted because she had believed he never looked at her call log. He had never looked at her call log. Until he did, for a reason she never established. Boredom, instinct, something falling out of the ordinary domestic rhythm. He asked her about the number, casually. They were making dinner. He said, "Who's this? You called them last Tuesday." She had the answer ready within a single second. An answer that was internally consistent, plausible, connected to her work in a way he could verify if he tried and would find no obvious contradiction. She delivered it at the right pace, with the right amount of absence of emphasis. She did not defend it. She stated it and moved on. He said, "Okay." He handed her the pepper, and they finished making dinner. She did not show anything. She held it through dinner, through clearing the table, through the conversation afterward about something entirely unrelated. She held it completely. At 10:15 that night, she sent her handler a message from the second phone. 3 words. The agreed signal for possible internal breach, assess urgency. Her handler responded in 40 minutes. His response was a single instruction. Evaluate and report fully. Do not act yet. She evaluated. She reported. She said, "I believe he accepted the answer. I believe the risk is contained." Her handler said, "We may need to discuss the timeline." She understood this to mean extraction was back on the table. She understood this correctly. What she did not fully process, in the hours after that exchange, was that the near abort had changed something in her own assessment of what she was doing. That it had introduced a hesitation that hadn't been there before. Not about the operation, about Daniel, about what it meant that she had answered him with such technical precision in the moment, and then immediately sent a message to someone else assessing whether he had believed her. She had managed him, cleanly, efficiently, without visible seam, and she was not certain anymore how she felt about being that good at it. She went back to the architect the following week. The second meeting. He was alone this time. He was warmer than he had been. He mentioned Raza, casually, as a mutual acquaintance, the way you mention someone to establish shared ground. She responded naturally. She asked how Raza was managing. The architect said, "You know Raza. He always lands on his feet." He said it with a small smile. She smiled back. She registered, somewhere she didn't have language for yet, that the smile had not been about Raza at all. The meeting with the architect had ended on a smile she couldn't place. She spent 3 days with it. Not obsessively, she had trained herself out of obsession the way you train yourself out of any habit that makes you unreliable. But the smile sat in the back of her operational thinking the way a small sound sits in the back of a quiet room. Present. Unaccounted for. She did not report it. She told herself it was insufficient data. She had, over 5 years, developed a very precise internal threshold for what constituted reportable intelligence versus unverified noise. The smile sat below the threshold. She left it there. This was the first misjudgment of the execution phase. It would not be the last. Her handler had given her a specific objective for this stage: find a reason to be present at a gathering that both the accountant and the architect attended simultaneously. Not to force a connection between them, that would be visible, and visible was the one thing she could not afford, but to observe how they interacted in each other's presence, whether they acknowledged a relationship beyond the casual, whether something in the social geometry between them shifted when they were in the same room. She spent 2 weeks engineering the opportunity. This is the part of deep cover work that looks, from the outside, like nothing. A dinner invitation extended through the right person. A scheduling conversation maneuvered across 3 intermediaries. The patient, invisible construction of a situation that would appear, when it finally occurred, entirely natural. The gathering was a small professional dinner. 8 people. A private room in a restaurant the network used regularly for exactly this kind of semi-formal, semi-social occasion. She arrived on time, which was slightly early for this particular crowd. She took a seat that gave her sightlines to the door and to the majority of the table. She ordered sparkling water and held it without drinking it and waited. The accountant arrived third. He greeted her with the warmth he had developed over the preceding weeks, the warmth she had built deliberately and that had, as these things do when built well, begun to feel to both of them like something that had always been there. The architect did not arrive. She held her reaction inside a polite question to the person beside her about something entirely unrelated. She did not look at the door again. She did not ask about the architect directly. She let the dinner proceed, and she was present and engaged, and she produced nothing that evening that her handler would have characterized as operational output. On the way home, she processed the absence. 2 explanations. 1, the architect had not been invited, and the gathering had never been the overlap opportunity she had constructed it to be, which meant 2 weeks of social engineering had produced a dinner that was simply a dinner. 2, he had been invited and had chosen not to come, which meant either ordinary scheduling or something that was not ordinary scheduling. She reported this to her handler as opportunity incomplete, cause undetermined, recommend patience. Her handler said, "We don't have patience left. The timeline is compressing." "Move directly." She asked what directly meant. He told her. She sat with it. Moving directly meant bypassing the gradual naturalism she had always used as her primary protection. It meant manufacturing a reason to be alone with the architect in a context specific enough to produce the kind of conversation that had so far happened only at the accountant's pace and on the accountant's terms. She told her handler she needed 48 hours to find the right mechanism. She used 36 of them. The mechanism she found was thin. She knew it was thin when she constructed it. A professional question. Specific enough to justify a direct approach, general enough not to alarm, delivered through a message that struck the right tone between casual and purposeful. She sent it. She waited. He responded in 4 hours. He suggested they meet the following afternoon. He named a place, not a restaurant this time, not a professional setting. A gallery. He mentioned that he went there most weeks. She told Daniel she had a client walk through on a property across the city. She left at noon. She was aware on the way that the lie to Daniel had become, over 5 years, structurally indistinguishable from any other sentence she said to him. It cost her nothing cognitively to produce. The fluency of it was the thing she noticed. Not guilt, the absence of friction. She arrived at the gallery 8 minutes early and walked 2 of the rooms before he got there, partly to settle herself, partly because she genuinely needed to see something that wasn't operational for 5 minutes. The architect arrived on time. He was relaxed in a way he hadn't been at the first meeting. She read this as progress. She would later understand it as something else. They talked for 40 minutes. She moved the conversation from professional to personal and back in the rhythm that she had refined over years, never pushing, always creating the conditions in which the other person chose to go further than they'd intended. He mentioned Raza twice, both times unprompted, both times with a lightness that she registered but filed under. He is establishing common ground. Then he said something that appeared in the moment to be exactly what she needed. He referenced a specific transaction. Not directly, he was not careless enough for that. He referenced the shape of it, the structure. He said it the way people say things they want you to know without wanting to be the person who told you. A plausible deniability baked into the syntax. She responded precisely correctly. She gave him just enough to confirm she had understood, without confirming she had understood. He nodded, changed the subject, said the gallery had acquired something new in the East Room that was worth seeing. She reported this to her handler that evening as a significant lead. Her handler agreed. He told her to develop it carefully. He told her not to push the architect further until they had processed what she'd given them. She agreed. She put down the second phone. She went to Daniel, who was reading in the other room, and she sat beside him on the sofa, and she did not say anything for a while, and he did not say anything either, and it was, in that particular moment, the most uncomplicated she had felt in weeks. She believed, in that hour, that the execution phase was working, that she had threaded the needle, that the patient, invisible architecture of the previous 5 years had finally produced the kind of tangible operational output that justified all of it. This was the false release moment. What she had not accounted for, what she had no mechanism to account for, because the information did not exist anywhere in her operational picture, was that the transaction the architect had referenced was not a lead. It was a marker, a specific, carefully constructed piece of information released deliberately into the conversation for the purpose of tracking where it went next. She had received it. She had reported it. And in reporting it, she had done precisely what it had been designed to make her do. She didn't know this yet. She would not know this for another 3 weeks. In the meantime, she continued working. She met the accountant twice more. She attended another gathering. She produced 2 further reports that her handler assessed as strong. She maintained the apartment, the job, the marriage. She answered Daniel's questions with the appropriate answers. She slept badly on Tuesday nights for reasons she had stopped trying to examine. She believed the operation was in its final productive phase. She was right about that. She was wrong about which side was producing. And in a city she had not traveled to and a room she had no knowledge of, 2 people were having a conversation about her that had been made possible, in part by everything she had just done correctly. The confirmation came on a Thursday, not through Miriam, not through anything the execution phase had produced. A procedural error, a communication routed through a channel that had been flagged 18 months earlier and never fully closed, gave the analysts enough to make the identification they had been working toward for 3 years. The mole was named. The case was handed to a different department. The operational file was marked in the language these files use as resolved. Miriam was informed by her handler in a message that was 4 sentences long. The operation is concluding. Begin documented when down. Extraction timeline to follow. Well done. She read it twice. She set the phone down. She picked it up and read it again. She told herself the flatness she felt was exhaustion. She had been telling herself that for approximately 2 years. The wind down did not feel like an ending. It felt like a controlled demolition of something she had built by hand. Each piece of the operational architecture had to be carefully dismantled in a sequence that left no visible trace. Professional relationships tapered with plausible reasons. Social contact reduced gradually, not suddenly, because sudden absence is the thing that prompts questions. The accountant received less of her time. The architect, one brief and professionally cordial message that closed a loop without closing anything else. Raza she avoided entirely. She told herself this was operational hygiene. It was also, though she did not say this to her handler, that she did not trust herself to sit across from him now that she was leaving, now that the stakes of the performance had changed, and not show something she had been suppressing for months. Not guilt, exactly, something adjacent to it. The feeling of having spent significant time inside a relationship whose terms only one party had known. The irony of that, given what she did not yet know about Raza, would have been considerable. Her handler had told her the transition would take 6 to 8 weeks. It took 11. Operational wind downs always take longer than the timeline they are given because the people designing the timeline are not the people doing the work. This is a structural truth about intelligence operations that does not change regardless of how experienced the people involved are. During those 11 weeks, Miriam continued to live the life. She went to work, she came home, she made dinner, she answered Daniel's questions with the appropriate answers. She participated in the ordinary maintenance of a marriage, the scheduling, the small negotiations, the 1,000 daily acts of consideration that constitute a shared life, with a precision that had become, she understood now, purely technical. She had loved him. She was certain of this in the way you are certain of something you can no longer fully feel, the way you know the shape of a room you have left. But the operational requirements of the wind down required her to keep the frame intact until she was ready to remove it, which meant she was being present in her marriage in exactly the way she had always been present, with care, with attention, with the appropriate emotional signals, for reasons that were now entirely different from what they had been at the start. This distinction mattered to her. She was not sure it would matter to Daniel. She found out about Raza 3 days before her extraction. Her handler told her, in the second-to-last meeting they would have before she left. He told her not because she needed the information operationally, the operation was over, the information had no further function, but because she would be debriefed extensively and the debrief would cover it, and he wanted her to have time to process it before she was in a room being asked to account for her assessments. He told her that Raza had known, or suspected, for somewhere between 18 and 24 months, that a partial profile, sourced ultimately from the mole, had circulated inside the network long enough for a careful person to hold it against her and find points of alignment. That Raza had not reported her to the network, not because he was protecting her, but because an unconfirmed and manageable intelligence operative was more useful to him than the disruption her exposure would have caused. He told her that a portion of the intelligence she had produced from the Raza relationship, the material she had assessed as her most reliable, had been selectively shaped. Not fabricated, shaped. True information, released on Raza's timeline, calibrated to produce specific reporting. The transaction the architect had referenced in the gallery, the marker, had reached the architect through Raza. Not directly, through 2 intermediaries who hadn't known what they were carrying. She had been, without knowing it, a distribution channel for intelligence Raza wanted her handlers to receive. Her handler told her this in the same measured tone he used for everything. He told her the assessments based on that material were being reviewed. He told her the overall operational outcome was not compromised. He told her that her performance, in the context of a counter-deception she had no way to detect, was considered professionally sound. She listened to all of this. She asked one question. She asked whether her report, the specific report in which she had told him, with confidence, that Raza's trust was complete, had been used to make decisions that kept the operation running past the point where it should have been assessed. Her handler did not answer immediately. The pause was the answer. She left the city on a Tuesday morning. Daniel drove her to the station for what he understood to be a work trip. He would receive, in the following weeks, a version of events, assembled and delivered through channels she would not be part of, that explained her absence, her non-return, in terms designed to be confusing but not alarming. A story with enough substance to resist casual investigation and enough ambiguity to prevent definitive conclusion. He would not receive the truth. The decision about that had been made at a level above her handler. She had not been consulted. She did not say anything significant at the station. She had thought, during the 11 weeks of wind down, that she might find a way to say something true to him before she left. Not a confession. Not the kind of truth that the operational constraints would never permit. But something. Some small piece of the actual texture of what they had shared that she could leave him with. She didn't. She held him for a moment longer than usual. He noticed. He asked if she was all right. She said she was tired. He said she should sleep on the train. She did not sleep on the train. The debrief lasted 9 days. It was thorough in the way that institutional accountability is thorough, focused primarily on the decisions that had produced complications, less focused on the structural conditions that had made those decisions likely. Her report on Raza's trust was reviewed in detail. The decision to stay after Raza's arrest was reviewed. The 11-week wind-down overrun was noted. She was not formally sanctioned. She was told her service had been valued. She was given 4 months of administrative leave and a recommendation for a transitional support program that she would eventually decline. What the operation cost is not a figure anyone calculated in full. Partial sums exist: the Raza intelligence that required re-evaluation, the analytical work built on assessments that were now uncertain, the time and resource cost of a 3-year mole hunt that concluded, ultimately, through a channel entirely separate from the operation mounted to support it. Daniel is out there somewhere, in a different city now. He left within a year. People who knew him before say he became harder to reach in the final months, and then simply stopped being reachable. He was never a liability. He was never a complication in the operational sense. He was a person who loved someone, who built a life with someone, and who was then left to determine, without any assistance from the institutions that had used that life as infrastructure, which parts of it had been real, and which parts had served a purpose he had not been told about. There is no process for that. There is no debrief for the civilian who was the cover. He got the shape of the story eventually. Not the details, not the names, not the reasons. Just enough to understand that the years he had believed were one thing had also been another thing, simultaneously, without his knowledge or consent. What a person does with that understanding is not something any intelligence assessment accounts for. It should. If any part of this story unsettled you, not for its drama, but for the machinery of it, the way it used ordinary life as its primary instrument, then you are watching the right channel. Subscribe. The next operation goes deeper.